Working the night shift as a nurse was never easy, but I always appreciated the quiet calm that the early hours brought to the hospital. While the city streets slept, I cared for patients at a slower, more deliberate pace, far from the chaos of the daytime rush. The hospital where I work is small, nestled in an even smaller town, where everyone knows everyone. It was the kind of place where coworkers felt like family. That's why it was so jarring when a new janitor, Paul, arrived to replace old Bill, who had worked there for over 20 years before retiring. Paul was tall and thin, with an empty stare and calculated movements. He barely spoke, offering only a near-mechanical nod when passing through the halls. At first, no one paid much attention to him. He did his job quietly, and if something seemed off, it was easier to dismiss it than to stir up trouble. But during my third week of working alongside him on the night shift, things began to feel different. One night, as I made my rounds, I noticed something out of place. A patient's medical file had been taken from the cabinet and left open on the nurse's station counter, turned to a seemingly random page. I asked the staff if anyone had moved it, but everyone denied it. I thought maybe I had left it there by mistake, but it kept happening night after night. Then there were the lights. At first, it was small flickers in the corridors. But soon, entire sections would be plunged into darkness, as if someone were playing with the fuses. The sense that something was wrong was palpable, but no one seemed willing to admit it. The following week, unease turned into fear. I started seeing Paul in places he wasn't supposed to be, standing at the end of empty hallways or lingering in front of locked doors, staring at them as if he could hear something on the other side. One night, I heard a metallic clanging coming from the supply room. When I got there, the door was unlocked, something that should never happen. But the room was empty. A few boxes were knocked over, and there was an unshakable sense that I wasn't alone. That night, I decided to pay closer attention to Paul. During my breaks, I watched him from a distance, trying to understand his behavior. He never spoke to patients or staff, simply roaming the hospital as if he knew something the rest of us didn't. Then I began noticing things going missing. Small personal items from patients, watches, rings, even a special blanket belonging to an elderly woman, disappeared without explanation. Around the same time, critical medical records also went missing, only to reappear days later, often with missing pages or strange annotations. I spoke with the night supervisor, but he just shrugged it off, suggesting it was likely a clerical error. Still, there was something about Paul's hollow gaze and the way he always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time that unsettled me. Things escalated when patients started reporting strange occurrences. Whispers in the corridors, footsteps when no one was there. I didn't know what to do, but I was certain Paul was at the center of it all. Then, the sense of being watched began to follow me. During my rounds, I'd glance over my shoulder and feel as though someone had just slipped out of view. One night, while walking through the pediatric ward, which was empty at that hour, I heard a strange scraping sound coming from one of the rooms. It was slow and deliberate, like something being dragged across the floor. I opened the door cautiously but found no one there. The only thing out of place was a wheelchair, sitting in the middle of the room and facing the door, as if someone had just left it there. I scanned the hallway, but it was empty. As I turned to leave, I saw Paul at the far end of the corridor, watching me. He said nothing, standing there for a few seconds before turning and disappearing down one of the emergency stairwells. That was when I decided to investigate. During one of my breaks, I went to the maintenance closet where Paul stored his supplies. It was a small, cluttered space filled with cleaning products and tools. At the back of the room, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a pile of personal items that had gone missing. The elderly patient's blanket, a bracelet, even the ID badge of an employee who had recently transferred to another shift. But there was something even more chilling, a folder filled with newspaper clippings about recent crimes in town. The articles detailed break-ins, disappearances, and even a murder. The one connection between all the cases. They all occurred within blocks of the hospital. My eyes locked onto a grainy photo in one of the articles. The suspect's description matched Paul's height and build. My heart raced as the realization hit me. I was working alongside someone dangerous. After that discovery, coming to work felt unbearable. Every time I passed Paul in the hallways, the air grew heavier, as if he knew I had seen something I shouldn't have. He never looked at me directly, but the tension was undeniable. The flickering lights became more frequent, always in the same areas where Paul had recently been. One night, while reviewing patient records at the nurse's station, the lights dimmed again. I glanced at the computer monitor, and for a split second, a security camera feed flashed on the screen. It showed the main corridor, and there was Paul standing outside a patient's room holding what looked like a small notebook. Before I could process what I was seeing, the screen went black. I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. I snapped a quick photo of the newspaper clippings I had found and went to the supervisor's office during my break. I laid out everything I had discovered, showing him the evidence. He seemed uncomfortable but tried to downplay it. It's probably just a misunderstanding. Paul passed a background check like everyone else, he said. Frustrated, I realized I had to take matters into my own hands. That night, after my shift ended, I stayed behind and followed Paul discreetly through the hospital. He moved quickly, his steps purposeful, as if he had a destination in mind. He entered a storage room that was rarely used, and I waited a few moments before approaching. Peering through a crack in the door, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Paul was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the stolen items. He was murmuring something under his breath, low and incomprehensible. In the center of the room was a pile of torn medical files and handwritten notes, some covered in disturbing sketches of distorted faces and human-like figures. My heart pounded as I accidentally stepped on something, creating a noise. Paul stopped murmuring and slowly turned his head toward the door, his eyes locking onto mine through the gap. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I sprinted down the corridor, heart racing, and went straight to the security office. The guard hesitated but eventually called the police. By the time they arrived, Paul was gone, but the storage room remained as I'd found it. The evidence was enough to launch an investigation. In the following days, we learned that Paul had used a fake identity to get the job. Police found more clippings in his home, connecting him to recent crimes and potentially others that had gone unsolved. The hospital was in shock, but one question haunted me. What had he been planning? And why had he fixated on this place and its people? I haven't seen Paul since. The police believe he fled to another town, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the hospital at night, I feel as though part of him is still here. The eerie silence in the corridors, the unexplained flickering lights. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks, or maybe he left more than just stolen objects behind. I just hope I never have to find out. Working the night shift at the supermarket always had its ups and downs. After 10 o'clock, the place was almost deserted, and the silence was so overwhelming that even the hum of the air conditioning felt deafening. Most of the time, I liked it. I could go about my tasks in peace, stacking boxes, restocking shelves, and handling the occasional late-night customer. But last week, my manager asked me to do something different. That old storage room in the back needs organizing, he said, as if it were just another task. The storage room had been locked up for years, used as an improvised dumping ground for things no one wanted anymore. It didn't seem like a big deal, so I grabbed the rusted key and headed over, ready to spend a few hours clearing out useless junk. At the time, I had no idea how much that room would change my perception of the place. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a wave of dust and the stench of mildew. The room was crammed with carelessly stacked boxes, ancient cans of discontinued products, and rusted tools. I flicked on the fluorescent light, which buzzed and flickered for a few seconds before settling into a cold, dim glow. I started stacking boxes to clear some space, and that's when I heard it for the first time. A faint sound, like a soft tapping coming from the back wall. I froze for a moment, trying to figure out what it was. Maybe it was the plumbing or a rat scurrying inside the wall. Shaking my head, I went back to work, but an unsettling feeling crept over me, like the room was alive in a way it shouldn't be. As I continued organizing, I found things that didn't make sense. At the bottom of a stack of torn boxes, I uncovered an old clipboard with inventory notes dated over 15 years ago. Wedged between the yellowed pages was a crumpled piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was frantic, the letters pressed deep into the paper, and it simply read, "Please help me. I'm here." My first thought was that it was a prank or some leftover joke from a former employee, but something about the shaky, desperate writing unsettled me. I set the note aside and kept working, but the tapping sound returned, louder this time, as if it was coming from inside the room rather than the walls. I spun around quickly, but everything was where it had been. Still, the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone began to sink in. Throughout the night, the noises persisted. They came in intervals, sometimes so faint they blended with the hum of the fluorescent lights, other times loud enough to make me stop what I was doing. That's when I found the second note. It was folded and tucked under a rusted can of paint. This one was longer. "They won't let me leave. Don't trust anyone. I'm still here." My heart raced. I scanned the room, searching for an explanation for these notes. Maybe someone had worked here years ago, writing some kind of bizarre diary. But the air felt heavier now, almost oppressive, as if the walls themselves were harboring something I wasn't prepared to face. With the notes weighing on my mind, I started to look more closely at the room. The walls, which had once been just a dull background, seemed to call for my attention. I noticed scratches near the baseboards, like someone or something had tried to claw at the surface. What once seemed like a dusty, forgotten storage space now felt hostile, alive. Every tap or strange sound made my breath hitch, and I began questioning whether I should be in there alone. But my curiosity outweighed my fear. I pulled out my phone to take pictures of the notes and the scratches on the walls. As I did, the fluorescent light flickered again, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of the room. I froze, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. Then I found the third note. It was hidden inside a box filled with old documents. Unlike the others, this one was far more specific. Check the walls. They hid everything there. The words felt less like a clue and more like a command. I grabbed a flashlight I'd found earlier and started inspecting the walls, running the beam slowly over every inch. That's when I noticed it. A section of the wall where the paneling was loose, barely held in place by a rusted nail. My heart pounded as I pried it open, revealing a hidden cavity behind the wall. Inside was a small, sealed envelope with the name Eric written on the front. Eric. The name rang a bell, but I couldn't place it. Then it hit me. Eric was the name of an employee who had vanished over a decade ago. The rumor was that he'd quit without notice and left town, but it seemed the truth was far more complicated. I carefully opened the envelope, feeling like I was trespassing on something sacred. Inside were several sheets of paper covered in frantic, scrawled handwriting. The first lines made my stomach drop. "If you're reading this, please tell someone. They won't let you leave. Don't trust anyone, especially the managers. They know." I kept reading, my pulse racing. Eric described being locked in the storage room for reasons he never fully understood, though he hinted at something sinister, a list of problem employees who had learned too much about shady activities involving the management. He believed the room had been used for something dark, something he was close to uncovering before he was silenced. The final lines were almost illegible, but the words, "No one is safe," were clear enough to send chills down my spine. As I tried to process what I just read, the noises around me grew louder, more immediate. I glanced at the door, which was ajar, and felt certain someone was just outside, waiting. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, with a flickering bulb at the far end. I stuffed the notes and the envelope into my jacket pocket and left the room, trying to keep calm. When I turned to lock the door, my breath caught in my throat. There were handprints on the glass window of the door, pressed from the inside. That couldn't be right. I had been alone the entire time, or so I thought. After leaving the storage room, I couldn't focus on my work. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I decided to tell my manager everything, even though Eric's notes had made me suspicious of him. When I confronted him, mentioning the notes and Eric's name, he froze for a moment before letting out a nervous laugh. "Eric? He quit years ago. These old stories still spook the new employees." But his tone didn't convince me. felt like he was trying to dismiss something he knew was true. I left his office more confused and alarmed than before. The only way to get to the bottom of this, I decided, was to return to the storage room later that night when everyone else had gone home. That night, I returned with a flashlight and the notes in hand. Determined to uncover the truth, I inspected every corner of the room. I found another loose section of the wall and pried it open. Inside was a rusted metal box. Inside the box were more papers, along with Eric's employee badge. But the most chilling discovery was a key with a tag that read "Manager's Locker." Suddenly, everything clicked. Eric's story, the missing items, the disappearances. Before I could fully process it, I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. I turned off my flashlight and hid behind a stack of boxes, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and the handle began to turn. I stayed hidden as the door creaked open. I didn't see who entered, but I heard the same faint tapping sound I'd been hearing all night, now rhythmic and deliberate. As soon as the footsteps retreated, I bolted from the room and went straight to the police with everything I'd found. They launched an investigation, but, predictably, the managers denied any involvement. A few weeks later, the manager who'd laughed at me abruptly quit without explanation. The case was quietly closed, and I was left with more questions than answers. But I know what I saw and read. I still have nightmares about those notes, about the feeling of being watched, and worst of all, about the idea that something or someone is still trapped in that room, waiting for the next person to open the wrong door. Working the night shift in the IT department of a large company was, at best, monotonous. It was just me, a lukewarm cup of coffee, and the endless wait for tickets from employees who forgot their passwords or couldn't figure out the printer settings. The company occupied a massive building, but most of it was deserted during the night. Entire floors were often sealed off, especially since renovations started on the third floor. On one particular night, I was killing time with a game on my phone when a new ticket popped up in the system. The message was simple: Workstation 3B12 not responding. Please check. I sighed, marked it as in progress, and sent an automated response. The workstation was on the floor under renovation, so I assumed it was a system error and ignored it. But then things got strange. About 40 minutes later, another ticket came in from the same computer, but this time with a different message: files disappearing. Please review immediately. That was unusual. The system should have completely disconnected that area during the renovations. I decided to check the database to see who was assigned to that workstation. When the result appeared, it made me uncomfortable. The computer was assigned to someone named Daniel Smith, hired in 2008. So far, nothing out of the ordinary until I noticed one critical detail. His termination date was listed as 2010. That meant Daniel Smith hadn't worked there for over a decade. And yet, his workstation was still active and sending tickets. My first thought was that it had to be a system glitch. Maybe the workstation's information had never been updated after Daniel left. Still, the idea of an inactive computer sending tickets didn't make any sense. I decided to access the workstation's activity logs to see what was happening. To my surprise, the logs showed that the computer had been powered on multiple times in the past few days, always between midnight and 3 a.m. The strangest part? The user logged in during these sessions was Daniel Smith. My heart began to race. That shouldn't have been possible. Even if someone was using the workstation, the system wouldn't allow login credentials for an employee who had been terminated years ago. Something was definitely wrong. I decided to check out the third floor. It was against the rules. The floor was closed for renovations, but I needed to see it for myself. I grabbed a flashlight and took the emergency stairs since the elevators were disabled for that floor. The place was eerily quiet, lit only by dim emergency lights casting flickering shadows across the walls. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps on the concrete floor. When I reached the area where workstation 3B12 was located, a chill ran down my spine. The desk looked exactly as you'd expect in a construction zone, covered in dust, with the equipment unplugged and cables strewn about. But one detail was impossible to ignore. The monitor was on, displaying the login screen with Daniel Smith's name already filled in, as if someone had been trying to log in at that very moment. My pulse quickened. The login screen flickered faintly, like it was caught in a loop between loading and freezing. I approached cautiously, gripping the flashlight tightly, and scanned the room to make sure I was alone. No one else was there, at least no one I could see, but the workstation felt alive. The keyboard and mouse were spotless, free of the thick dust that covered everything else. I was torn between fear and curiosity. Without thinking, I moved the mouse. The screen went black instantly. I tried turning the computer back on, but it was dead, as if it had been unplugged the moment I touched it. The silence around me grew heavy, almost suffocating, as though the room itself was holding its breath. I decided to return to my desk and review the security logs to make sense of what had just happened. As I descended the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Each time I looked back, the hallway behind me was empty, but the sensation lingered. When I finally sat down at my terminal, I pulled up the logs for the 3rd floor. What I found made my throat dry up. Just minutes before I reached the workstation, there was a successful login recorded for user Daniel Smith. Even more chilling, the system showed another ticket sent just before I arrived. "You shouldn't be here." A wave of cold swept over me. How was this possible? Who or what was using that computer? My mind raced for logical explanations. Maybe it was a prank by someone on the team, someone with enough technical knowledge to manipulate the logs. But the dust-free monitor and keyboard gnawed at me. I decided to dig deeper into Daniel Smith's records. I accessed the internal employee database, and what I found only deepened the mystery. Daniel had been abruptly terminated in 2010, but the reason was listed as undisclosed. Additionally, his profile contained an encrypted note that only managers could access. It was clear that something about his case had been deliberately hidden. I felt a growing sense of dread but knew I needed answers. I headed to the HR archive room in the basement. The basement had always felt unsettling, but this time it was worse. The narrow shelves packed with dusty files created a maze of claustrophobic aisles, and my footsteps echoed unnaturally loud. I finally located Daniel Smith's file. It was thinner than most, as though documents had been removed over the years. Inside were only basic employment records and one peculiar memo. The memo read, "Workstation 3B12 deactivated. Do not reassign." My stomach turned. Why would a deactivated workstation still be generating tickets? And why did it seem like so much effort had gone into erasing Daniel's history? As I read, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It was soft but distinct, coming from somewhere above me, directly below the 3rd floor. Back at my terminal, I couldn't concentrate. The tapping sound haunted me, and the 3rd floor seemed to call me back, like it had more secrets to reveal. Ignoring my better judgment, I decided to return, this time with tools to open the workstation. If there was something physically inside it causing these anomalies, I needed to find out. The floor was even quieter than before, the air heavy with a suffocating stillness. The monitor was dark, but the room felt charged, like it was waiting. I pried open the workstation's case, my hands trembling. Inside, among the dust and cables, I found something that shouldn't have been there. An old external hard drive. It was larger than modern models, coated in a thin layer of grime but still intact. I took it back to my desk and plugged it into the system. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The drive contained dozens of audio files, all dated between 2009 and 2010. My heart raced as I clicked on the first one. The recording was filled with static, but a male voice came through clearly. "I know what you did. You won't silence me." The voice was angry, desperate, and it sounded like someone who knew their time was running out. As I listened to more recordings, it became clear that Daniel had uncovered something about the company. Something dangerous enough to get him silenced. The final recording was mostly silence, broken only by a single chilling sentence. "I'm still here." I immediately unplugged the drive. Couldn't sleep that night. The next day, I reported everything to my supervisor. He listened carefully, but when I finished, he simply said, "Forget about it. Focus on your work. That confirmed my worst fears, they knew. Since then, I've avoided the third floor, but the tickets keep coming, each one more direct and unnerving than the last. Sometimes, I feel like I'm being watched, like something is waiting for me to take the next step. Whatever happened to Daniel Smith, one thing is certain. He never truly left. Working the night shift at a parking garage seemed like the perfect job to balance with college. All I had to do was monitor the cameras, issue tickets when someone entered, and make sure the few cars parked overnight stayed secure. The garage had 5 levels, most of them completely empty after 11 at night. My booth was small, with a monitor displaying feeds from all the cameras and a tiny window overlooking the entrance. At first, I enjoyed the quiet and the extra time to study, but after a few weeks, I started noticing things I couldn't explain. It was always in the early hours of the morning, when the place was utterly deserted, that I'd hear footsteps echoing from the upper levels. I told myself it was just the wind or the sound of the building settling, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like someone was actually there. One night, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the stairs, leaving my booth behind. The sound of my own footsteps seemed amplified against the concrete walls. But when I reached the second level, the footsteps I'd heard earlier had stopped. I walked the entire level, moving through rows of parked cars, but found no one. Returning to my booth, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid from the long hours and lack of sleep. But when I looked at the camera feeds, my stomach dropped. On the screen showing the stairwell to the third floor, a figure quickly passed by, almost like a shadow. I grabbed the flashlight and rushed back out, heading to the third floor. When I got there, the space was empty, the only sound the faint whistle of wind through the open levels. That night, I realized something wasn't right about the place. Something that didn't belong to the normal rhythm of my quiet shifts. The next night, things got even stranger. As I watched the monitors, something caught my eye. On the camera for the stairwell leading to the 5th floor, the same figure appeared again, this time standing still at the top of the steps. There weren't any details visible, just an unmoving silhouette. I grabbed the flashlight but hesitated before leaving the booth. The thought of someone or something being up there at that hour sent a chill down my spine. Still, I pushed myself to check it out. I raced up the 5 levels, my heart pounding like a drum. But, just like before, there was no one there. What unsettled me even more was that the cameras had stayed active while I was gone, and they didn't show anyone leaving the stairwell. It was as if the figure had vanished into thin air. I started questioning my sanity. I tried to shake off the incident, but around 3 a.m., the phone in the booth rang. That phone was rarely used. Most people preferred to contact the intercom at the entrance. When I answered, all I heard at first was static. Then, a low, almost indistinct voice said something that made my blood run cold. "You're late." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I looked around, scanning the monitors for any sign of movement, but everything appeared calm. The feeling that someone or something was watching me became unbearable. I locked the booth door and resolved not to leave for the rest of the night, but I had no idea that this was only the beginning. The following night, I was on edge. Every sound, every flicker on the monitors sent a shiver down my spine. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps again, but this time they seemed much closer, coming from the level just below my booth. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window but saw nothing except the shadows cast by the streetlights outside. Returning to the monitors, I saw the figure again, this time on the stairwell to the 2nd floor. It stood motionless, head tilted slightly as if staring directly at the camera. I froze. Before I could do anything, the figure moved out of frame, walking slowly toward the main corridor. I reached for the flashlight again but stopped myself. Something deep inside warned me that if I went after it, I might not come back the same. I decided to keep watching the monitors, waiting for the figure to reappear, but what happened next was even worse. One of the cars parked on the 3rd level started flashing its headlights, as if someone were trying to unlock it remotely. But there was no one near the car, and according to the parking records, it had been sitting there untouched for weeks. I picked up the radio to call for external security, but before I could speak, A message appeared written in the dust on the car's rear window, as if someone had traced it with their finger. The message read, "I know where you are." I dropped the radio and ran back into the booth, locking the door. The oppressive feeling of being watched had escalated into something far worse. This wasn't paranoia anymore. Someone or something was hunting me. I spent the rest of the night glued to the monitors, but the figure didn't reappear. Still, the message on the car window was burned into my mind, and the fear of being watched turned every second into agony. When my shift finally ended, I went up to the 3rd level to check the car. The message was still there, a silent reminder that I wasn't imagining things. I tried wiping it off with my hand, but the letters wouldn't budge, almost as if they were etched into the glass. I hurried down the stairs, my heart racing, and vowed to request a shift change. But when I mentioned it to my supervisor the next day, he just laughed. "Everyone complains about the night shift at the parking garage," he said with a shrug. "It's just the place. It's a little weird. That night, something felt different. As soon as I entered the booth, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The monitors were working as usual, but I knew by now that the comm could be deceiving. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps started again, but this time they weren't coming from above or below. They were right outside the booth. I grabbed my flashlight, hands trembling, and shone it at the door's window, but saw nothing. Then the phone rang. My throat went dry as I answered, and, just like before, the call began with static. This time, the same low voice murmured something even more chilling. "You can't hide forever." Before I could respond, a metallic clanging sound echoed from the upper level, like something heavy had fallen. I dropped the phone and stared at the monitors, desperate for any sign of movement, but they showed only empty corridors. I couldn't stay put any longer. Against all logic, I grabbed the flashlight and left the booth. The metallic sound still echoed in my head as I climbed the stairs to the 5th level. With every step, the air grew colder, heavier, as if the building itself was pressing down on me. When I reached the top, the silence was deafening. In the middle of the empty floor, something caught the light of my flashlight. It was a small object glinting faintly on the ground. As I got closer, I realized it was my employee ID badge, the same one that had been clipped to my jacket just minutes earlier. My mind raced. How had it gotten there? As I tried to make sense of it, I heard the most terrifying sound yet. Footsteps behind me, quick and purposeful. I spun around, but no one was there. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That's when I saw it again, the figure standing at the far end of the stairwell. This time it was clearer, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was me, or rather, it looked like a distorted version of me, wearing the same jacket and holding a flashlight, but its face was pale, with hollow, empty eyes. We stood there for what felt like an eternity until it took a single step toward me. I dropped the flashlight and ran, stumbling down the stairs as fast as I could. When I finally reached the booth, I locked the door and shut off all the monitors. I didn't care anymore about what was happening. I just wanted to survive the night. As soon as my shift ended, I handed in my resignation. I've never gone back to that parking garage, but sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I still hear footsteps in the dark. I don't know if what I experienced was real or some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but the thought that the figure might still be watching me, waiting for me to return, haunts me. Whatever it was,